Again, yeah. Uh, Again, welcome everybody and good afternoon. My name is Farid Ferozi. I'm the Director of Evaluation and Innovation with the DC Bar Foundation. As we advertised, the purpose of today's meeting is to share with you the findings of a survey we conducted to collect DC residents' feedback on proposed CIR name. Uh, and as part of that process, we actually we conducted the survey through a comprehensive process, and as part of the DC Bar Foundation's strategy of engage all stakeholders and the CIR program's approach of engaging all stakeholders and the racial equity strategy that we are adapting. We collaborated with the mission partner, and through them, we engaged with over 400 DC residents and collected their feedbacks on three names for the CIR name. Actually, those three names were initially selected through a very comprehensive process and a very collaborative and consultative process with different stakeholders. And today, mission partner Bridget Pulley is here, who is the Chief Operating Officer and partner at Missions Partner, and she will be making the presentation on the process they took to complete this survey and the findings. And at the end, we will share with you the name that has been selected for the CIR. And just wanted to remind you that this meeting will be recorded.
Great. Thanks, Fareed. I can go ahead and share my screen so you all can follow along with some of the data that we were able to source for today's presentation. So as Fareed said, we conducted a survey of 3 potential names. We ran a soft launch of the survey in the first part of August, and then the survey ran in entirety from August 19th to September 24th. So that was kind of our window. And we worked with a group called Sentiment and sought to hear from folks who represented our target audience. I'll talk a little bit more about that, to weigh in on the different names that we were considering. So that's what we're going to review today. So we set out to survey a representative set of community members. So we first had to identify our criteria. We know that there are about 160,000 people who live in the DC area and are either at or below the 200% poverty level. So in order to achieve our representative sample, we knew we needed to hear from about 390 people in order to be able to reach that representative sample. And really what representative sampling means is that you generally get a sense of that group's answer to certain questions based on the numbers that you have. So for example, if you were to ask that same group of people, 160,000 people, whether they like DC Bar Foundation, and 100% of our representative sample said yes, then you could be confident that somewhere between 90% or 100% of any other person would give the same answer. So it lets you kind of, double click into a group and understand kind of roughly where the group would be. So we sought to hear from 390 people. We ended up hearing from 406. We wanted at least 50% of the people we heard from to live in wards 5, 7, and 8. And we were really happy. We had about 60% across wards 5, 7, and 8, and stayed under that 25% from ward 5, which was another metric. So really we wanted to hear from folks in ward 7 and 8. Ward 5 is our third preference. We wanted to make sure that at least 40% of the responses were from residents who identified as only non-Hispanic white. So the flip of that is we wanted 60% of our responses to be residents reflecting Black or African American identities, Hispanic identities, and so on. And you can see we were able to achieve that goal. And then we also knew that we wanted a household income of less than 30,120, which is that 200% poverty level. And 86% of people were below 30,000. So we hit that as well. We also think it's helpful to just look across the age and gender and household size. So we didn't have any defined goals here, but we did want to make sure that we had representation of folks over the age of 65. So 20% of people were over the age of 55, and that we had a nice representation of gender. And so you can see that played out really nicely too. So let's go into the names. We presented 3 different names: DC Resource Bridge, My District Link, and Turn Here DC. And we ask folks to think about these names in terms of a couple factors, or kind of primary 3 factors. So the first is about descriptiveness. So we wanted to understand, does the name make sense if you're thinking about a place where you might be able to find free legal help or reduced cost legal help? And what you can see here, we have what we call our top 3 box score. So this is people who selected very descriptive, descriptive, or somewhat descriptive. So we're looking at that, those kind of top 3 scores within a set. And what you can see is DC Resource Bridge rated very high. 82.6% of people identified it as at least somewhat to very descriptive. We also saw My District Link perform well, and Turn Here DC only, a little bit lower, only 56%. The next primary category we looked at was friendliness. So we wanted to understand, is the name easy to say? Is it easy to understand? And again, we saw DC Resource Bridge, very friendly to somewhat at about 90%. My District Link continued to score very high here, as did Turn Here DC. But again, we wanted to show you that kind of top 3 score, so you can see that DC Resource Bridge is edging out the other 2 in terms of friendliness. Our third primary category was memorability. So we wanted to make sure that the name would be easy to remember and to recognize. And here again, we see DC Resource Bridge with 84.5%. My District Link sounds like it might be a little bit more memorable. It's about a percentage point ahead of DC Resource Bridge, and then Turn Here DC coming in third. So if we look across those 3 categories of descriptiveness, friendliness, and memorability, and then across the 3 names, DC Resource Bridge, My District Link, and Turn Here DC, you see that DC Resource Bridge is scoring quite high in terms of descriptiveness and friendliness, and My District Link beat out DC Resource Bridge for memorability. I have a little bit more to share with you before we do the grand reveal, but let me just pause and see any questions from the group. Feel free to either come off mute or drop something in the chat if there's anything that you would like me to explain further, or anything you have a question or curiosity about. All right, I'll keep flowing. Yeah, go ahead.
I have 2 quick questions.
Sure, Nancy.
One, I'm just curious how you arrived at these 3 options. And then second, I noticed that none of them have the word legal in them, and I can see arguments why or why not, but I'm just curious whether there was any conversation among you about that prior to sharing the 3 options.
Yes, these are really great questions. And actually, my response to your second question will be answered in the first question. So we put together a set of criteria for the name. So we wanted to think about, do we need it to have location? As you can see, we decided location was very important. So you see DC represented across the 3. We talked about this idea of navigation or connection or bridging, and that's really what you start to see in the names as well. So we ideated with the team about different categories for consideration around the names, and then our team worked to come up with, I don't know, Fareed, dozens of different names. We worked through several iterations of presentations of those names, both to the DC Bar Foundation, CIR work group, Dina previously, Fareed and Kira, but then also to the broader group, that includes many more stakeholders to get feedback on the names. So the process started in February and we didn't test until August. So what you can see from that is it was quite an iterative process as we worked through the names. One of the things that we landed on as we were working on the names is that we actually wanted to keep it a little bit broader than legal, not because the CIR is going to start being a intake option for all social services across DC, but we wanted to leave the option and have a little bit more flexibility in the name. And that was one of the decision points we arrived at as we moved through the naming process, and why the names came out, those three names came out as they did. Fareed, anything, or Kira, anything you would add to that?
You explained it very well. Thank you, Bridget.
But also, yeah, I would add something to that. Even before we began working with Mission Partners, we had, and I had to drop for a second, so I may have missed this, but even before Mission Partners was in the picture, the CIR sort of core group that's been meeting, we had tossed around a number of ideas, taking into consideration sort of what the goal of coordinated intake is, what we knew some of the names of similar projects in other jurisdictions were, like what we thought would be attractive to folks. And we also, when we did focus groups, we've done, I don't know, 2 or 3 sets of focus groups. And a lot of that initial list, which was probably, I don't know, 15 or 20 names, was really informed by the feedback that we got in those initial focus groups about what would make this system work for you and what would make you trust it, what would make you want to call it or refer other people to it. But at the end of the day, we realized it sort of didn't matter what we thought, which is why we really wanted to make sure that we were approaching this the right way. But I would say, Nancy, this is probably, the name that we arrived at is probably derived from 30 or more different ideas and combinations from many different sources.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Let me speak to questions from Fritz and Barbara, and then I'll keep us moving in the interest of time. So the respondent sample, Fritz, I want to make sure I'm understanding this correctly. Are you talking about the demographics of that sample?
No, just how did you create a frame of people to be drawn? That is, the court tries hard, for example, to draw jurors from a broad swath of the population, and they use all sorts of sources like motor vehicle or benefit recipient or I don't know, tax records, whatever. Any sampling depends on starting with a frame of people that you're going to draw them from. I just wondered what yours was.
Yeah, great question. So we partnered with a group called Sentiment. Mission Partners has worked with them for many years. They provide online polling software that you can target based on who you're trying to reach. So if you want to reach Hispanic school teachers in Denver who are 22 to 35 and have a child at home, you can get that granular based on their pool of population. So that's why we work with an outside group to really make sure that we're kind of reaching a broad demographic, and we're able to kind of give our requirements, and then the group has qualifying questions to move them through. If they don't qualify, they get to take other surveys. If they do qualify, they get to take our survey. Barbara, I see your question. So did the respondents know what entity they were responding to questions about? We did include a description of the DC Bar Foundation in that opening language to let them know that that was the group that was sourcing the information. And then, I think your question about the lack of the word legal making word of mouth referral more difficult is a good one. And, we ultimately preferred that the name be more encompassing. And the hope is that that kind of more elastic name will help in the future. But I think it's a good question. And one of the ways that we're going to address, what it is the CIR does is through the messaging and making sure that's really clear, the visuals as well. So any concern about that not being obvious could be addressed there too. Okay, I'm going to jump back. I want to share a few other insights with you about what we learned in the survey. So we had a few other criteria that we were curious about, in addition to the 3 I just reviewed. So one is we wanted to understand which name sort of best represents our platform as we are intending it to be. And here we saw DC Resource Bridge was rated as the best representation of a phone and web-based way to connect DC residents with free or reduced cost support for legal services. We also asked people to just share their favorite name, which is always helpful. And in this case, my district link was the highest rated. So if you think these numbers might be a little confusing because they go from smaller to bigger, but if you think about who rated 1 versus 2 versus 3 in terms of their ranking, my district link won out with an average of 1.76. So the lower average number is the higher ranking. And then we also asked folks if they had any especially positive or negative reactions to the names, and this was really interesting. So names tended to be generally positive. We had only 6% of people say that they felt especially negative about any of the names. And otherwise, some people said, no, I don't feel too strongly one way or the other. On the especially positive breakdown, my district link came in at 42%, DC Resource Bridge at 37%. So of that 60%, this was the breakdown of how folks felt about the names in terms of positive. Now, what's interesting is some of the responses really talked about, when we think about DC Resource Bridge, talked about the friendliness of the name, the comfort that's conveyed, thinking, really positive feedback about the bridge as that symbol of connection and safety. So here are some quotes from what we heard in the survey. A bridge is described as a structure that takes you from one point to another point, for example. And then in terms of my district link, it did have the highest number of positive associations, but interestingly, a few responses also flagged that it sounded a little similar to the District Direct mobile app. So we wanted to make sure that information was shared as well. So much so that someone even said, I've used this app for 5 years. It's without normal application glitches. So they had positive things to say about the app, but we're confusing my district link with District Direct. So helpful to know that. So as we look across, I'll take your question in just a second, Kathy. As we look across those criteria, then, so our priority data set, we wanted to understand what's the most descriptive, what's the friendliest name, what's the most memorable name. And we see DC Resource Bridge as the first choice for most descriptive and friendliest, and most memorable is my district link. When we look at the secondary data set, so again, thinking about these as also important, but not our priority. Best representation, DC Resource Bridge. My district link won the personal ranking, and people felt especially positive about my district link. So we see a pretty strong preference for either DC Resource Bridge or my district link. I think either of those names could be really strong options. Though we do want to flag that DC Resource Bridge would be our recommendation because it does score higher in terms of friendliness and descriptiveness, and it avoids the confusion that my district link could create with the existing District Direct mobile app. So I won't give away what the final answer is, but I will just pause. I know, Kathy, you had a question before I turn it to the DC Bar Foundation team to tell you about what name we'll be moving forward with.
I can hold it. I don't want to take away their glory right now.
Okay. All right. Fareed, do you want to do the grand reveal? Oh, you're on mute, Fareed.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Bridget. Appreciate it. Yeah. As you can see that most of the recommendations we got and most of the respondents were in favor of DC resource bridge on a number of criteria that we ask people. So the DC Bar Foundation decided to officially announce DC Resource Bridge as the CIR system name. And in future communication, probably you will see this name associated with CIR gradually.
Yeah, and I think what's really exciting about this from my perspective is that it really was a community-led process. We heard from community members as we were thinking about, where to take the name. We talked to community members on the phone leading up to some of the naming exercises as well. And then the survey obviously gave us really strong results about how people see the name. So I think that's probably the most exciting from my perspective, is it wasn't like we were like, we really love this name, but that we heard directly from residents about what name resonates the most with them. I'm happy to answer any other questions that might come up. And the DC Bar Foundation team also has our contact information. I can drop it in the chat if you've got questions that you're curious about. I'm always happy to take those offline as well.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Any questions? Any concerns?
Kathy, was your question addressed?
Yeah, and this is all really cool that you guys did so much community listening and interviewing. I had a question related to the person who raised like the district link question, and I was wondering if you'd done other mapping onto like similar sounding names related to any of the others, because there's like with the link, there's like My Health Link, and there's a number of bridge programs out there, and I was wondering if that related to any of the like positive feelings people had about them because they had other programs. Like if I was just curious if there was any other mapping related to concerns about confusion or anything like that with any of these names.
Yeah, absolutely. So a couple things we were up against, including we wanted to have a name that was unique. So we didn't want a name like, if Resource Bridge is a nonprofit, we didn't want a name that was just adding DC to an existing organization, because we want to be able to trademark the name, get the URL, do all of that, and really kind of own the name and the identity. So that was admittedly a challenge in a naming process, because as you can imagine, there are so many entities out there in the world, as to your point, HealthLink, District Direct, etc. So we did extensive research on each of the names, and all three of those names we were able to verify stand on their own. Of course, I think about district bridges. There are other organizations that could, have a little bit of confusion, but in terms of the actual name that we're landing on, it is a standalone name that we're able to hopefully trademark and fully own. But it's a great question. Barbara, I also see your question about, was anyone canvassed who didn't know it was a legal group? So we did talk to, we have friends at Martha's Table who were able to connect us to a number of individuals who live in wards 5, 7, and 8, who we spoke to, who, were not aware when they were being originally asked to speak with us, that it was on behalf of a legal group. But we did want to talk to folks who both had existing experience seeking legal services and had not had experience seeking legal services. So our goal was to talk to folks from a little bit of both groups.
We have 2 more minutes. If there are any further questions, we would be happy to respond. Okay. Okay, thank you very much for your time. I appreciate the time you took to participate in this session, and we wanted to share this session with you and this important activity with you as part of the CIR implementation process. I wish for all of you a great rest of the afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thanks, folks.
Thank you, Bridget.